Hey everyone, welcome to Book Overflow. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here as always by my co-host Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
I'm doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, we are excited for this special episode of Book Overflow. We usually just read the books and discuss them, just Nathan and I. But today we were so fortunate that Mark Richards, one of the authors of Fundamentals of Software Architecture, came onto the podcast and talked to us about his experience writing it, what he's working on, and really just his thoughts on software engineering in general. It was a great conversation. How did you feel about it, Nathan?
Yeah, I thought it was awesome. He's written several books in software architecture. It's really shifted my thinking about how to approach things, especially organizationally. And we were able to dive into a lot of the in between facts, things that weren't necessarily in the book. And we also learned something really exciting, which is they're going to come out with a second edition of this, which he elaborates and talks about too.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic interview. We are really just so pleased and so honored that he took time out of his day to come and talk to us about his book. We really hope you enjoy this special interview with Mark Richards about the fundamentals of software architecture. Well, hey there, everyone. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here by Nathan Toups, my co-host on Book Overflow. But today, as a special guest, we have Mark Richards, the author of Fundamentals of Software Architecture. Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you for having me on the podcast. This is great.
Yeah, it's so cool to have you on. I guess our first question is, what inspired the writing of the fundamentals of software architecture?
Yeah. So, we published it in 2020. So that was about close to coming up on 5 years this January. But Neil Ford and I were observing about 7 years before this book came out. And both of us heavily involved in software architecture. And we observed that there's really not a comprehensive guide to becoming a software architect and what software architecture is all about. There are certainly books about different aspects of it, but nothing that really kind of brought everything together. So we realized this whole, and then the two of us started comparing all of the material that we did at conferences, that we did at user groups about software architecture, and also our collective experience, and realized quickly we had a lot of information. As a matter of fact, enough that spanned, in our opinion, the full gamut of software architecture. So it took us 7 years to write that book. Part of the challenge within there was, of course, taking probably 20,000 pages worth of text and whittling it down to about 450. However, part of what we wanted to do was take an engineering approach to understanding software architecture. And part of that were all of those star ratings that we actually developed for each of the architectural styles. Both Neil and I have extensive experience in all the architecture styles we wrote about. And so we started by saying, well, we should rate these as a guide for quantitative, or I should say qualitative analysis to help people decide, listen, I need a scalable system. What should I use? And so we came up with a list of architecture characteristics, and it took us 7 years to get those star ratings tuned. And so really our motivation for the book was just to have a comprehensive guide, start to end, for understanding what is software architecture and what does a software architect really do.
So, sure. With a time period of 7 years, did the focus or the goal of the book change over that time from where you thought it would start?
Oh, yes, actually changed quite a bit. One of the techniques that Neil and I have used basically on that we've written together is we come up with an idea, a concept, a way of presenting something. And both of us are involved in a lot of conferences, hundreds of conferences throughout our tenure. And we like to vet out the material at conferences. And what that allows us to do is to get pretty much real-time feedback from these live conferences about the material, questions that people have. And we take those questions and we say, that's a really good question that we didn't even cover. And so we would add that to the material. We would change material that people found confusing at conferences when we would give sessions about different things. It's like, I see this whole space-based thing, but I'm really not getting it. And it's like, that means we're probably not explaining it very well. And so those 7 years that took us to write this book, only about the past year was actually putting pen to paper and typing. By the time we started writing that, we knew exactly what we were going to write. And so this is a process that we carried over with our hard parts book, which was only about 4 years in the making. And it was the same process. We would vet out different concepts, different ideas, the way of explaining it, and get that real-time feedback. And so that was primarily our approach. But to answer your question, because of that kind of approach, things changed quite a bit. We would add or remove topics just based on level of interest, and actually presenting these things in classes as well. We've created a whole training class for this. We saw areas where people were like, this really doesn't match well. And we took that feedback and said, you know what, you're right. So that was really kind of the changes that happened. Our star ratings, as a matter of fact, started with a thumbs up and a thumbs down. That was it, just a binary. It's good at scalability, it's bad at scalability. Oh, well, once we did that, we quickly realized this is not really saying that service-based is good, but so is microservices. But microservices is a lot better. So we changed it to 3 stars, up to 3 stars up and 3 stars down.
Wow.
But then we realized, some of them run right in the middle. So we kind of needed like a little Caesar thumb. And then as we started to really learn more about these qualifications, we came to the fact that, 5 stars gives us better granularity to distinguish which of these architecture styles edges out over the others, because they do in terms of some of these characteristics. So there's a really good example of something that evolved up until close to the very end of the writing of that book.
You mentioned how you had to distill 20,000 pages down into roughly 400. We just wanted to say we felt the book was almost like light reading, but not because it wasn't heavy technical knowledge, but it was very easy to read, very easy to digest. We had a great time with it. You talk a lot in the book about trade-offs and how everything in software engineering is a trade-off. I can tell that's obviously a deeply held conviction you have in this field. What in your career led you to hold that so deeply?
Part of that was my age-old definition of architecture. So back in the day, all the luminaries, Martin Fowler, Kent Beck, the list goes on, all had their kind of one-liners for what is architecture. Architecture is the stuff that's hard to change, was a very popular one. Architecture is all about the important stuff, whatever that is. That was another very famous quote. Well, I added my famous quote to that list, and mine was, architecture is the stuff you can't Google.
We liked that one.
Yeah, I mean, should I use orchestration or choreography? Well, it depends. Okay, should I use async or sync on this? Well, it depends. And basically, every answer is that joke, it depends. And so that kind of led us to really understanding that software architecture is all about trade-offs. And that's where we developed our first law, based on the fact that there are no best practices in the structural aspect of architecture. Every environment, every situation is different. And a best practice is where you can just shut your brain off and blindly say, okay, let's do that. There's not one single one in the structural aspect. And so what do you do when there's no best practices? You have to analyze the trade-offs against your context. So that's what really led us to kind of coining that very first law, which we challenged and we continued to challenge together. And we basically formed our first corollary of that first law, as you read, which I love this one. If you think you've found something that doesn't have a trade-off, all it means is you haven't found it yet. Keep
Yes.
looking.
We talked about that with the idea of Chesterton's fence, which I believe, I can't remember if you wrote about that in the book, but the idea that if there is you come across a section of fence in the middle of a field and you're not sure why it's there, you might say, well, let's remove the fence. But you can't remove the fence until you know why the fence was built. And kind of in a similar way, you can't, if you haven't found the trade-off, then you just haven't identified the trade-off. We love that. We love that concept.
It's because it's there. Yeah. I like that metaphor too. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what went along with trade-offs is a term I used all the time, and I wasn't sure where I first heard it, but least worst architecture.
Yeah.
Because that's really what you're trying to do most of the time, especially if you're doing evolutionary architecture or if you're doing these incremental and iterative processes. Is you're just like, okay, what's the least worst thing I can do right now?
Yeah. Well, and as a matter of fact, I'm glad you pointed that piece out, because we always try to strive for the best solution. But this whole topic of trade-offs means that there's some things we're going to have to deal with. And all these trade-offs are messy. And so, yes, essentially, we do try to strive for the least worst choice that we have because of those trade-offs. Now, it's interesting that when we talk about different trade-offs, when we apply a context to them, we realize sometimes that trade-offs, they're there, but they become less significant. Well, the trade-off of this decision between security is security versus performance. Well, yeah, that's pretty significant. But for our situation, we don't have to worry about performance. I mean, we're magnitudes below any of our SLAs or SLOs we have. So while it's a trade-off, for us in that specific condition, it's not a significant trade-off. And so it makes the decision easier. And so part of that art of trade-off analysis is really qualifying these trade-offs, not just taking them as face value. We could certainly use ChatGPT, we can use Google, our book, to identify what are the trade-offs between A and B. But it's up to us to decide how significant those trade-offs are and how they match to the business goals. So yeah, there really is an art to it. Yeah.
We really enjoyed your focus on understanding the business domain and that a great architect can't be separated from it. That's something that it seems like a lot of engineers struggle with naturally. We really want to be immersed in the tech and we don't get as much into the business side. What advice would you have for any engineers who maybe feel more comfortable technologically and having trouble expanding to understand the business context?
Yeah, this is a very common problem. As a matter of fact, it was a common problem with me because I am very passionate about technology. I can give a hoot about insurance or trading. It just doesn't interest me much. Retail, I don't have a passion for it. I struggle to learn about these things. So that's the first challenge, is most of us are technologists. We're in this industry because we love and are passionate about technology. There's a couple of answers to your question. The first is there are paths, albeit I'm not fond of them, but there are paths within architecture of becoming what's typically called in most companies a technical architect. Now, this is an architect that stays in the weeds of technology. They typically become an uber expert in some domain area within technology. Maybe it's database, maybe it's cloud, maybe it's messaging, maybe it's integration points. And that architect tends to be a floater on various products and teams to be the answer person for a lot of these solutions. That is a path. I don't find it very rewarding. It's not, in my humble opinion, having written that book, how I would define a true software architect. But it is a path that a lot of people do take. But the better answer to your question is the fact of what basically I did. I was a technologist. I was in all sorts of domains. When I quickly realized when I became an application architect, it's like, I kind of have to know the business. I have to know these terms. I have to be able to communicate with business stakeholders, with product teams. And so what I did, and this is the advice I usually give, is to pick one or two domains that either you've got some credible experience in or that you may be half interested in, and focus on those couple of domains. Now, any given business domain, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of books to be able to get a kind of a head start. Hal McIntyre and the whole trading industry has written most of the books. A lot of those are on my bookshelf behind me. Banking, insurance, retail, warehousing, you name it, medical field, healthcare. There's a lot of business related books, and that's a great way to kind of get a head start. But here is the bottom line advice. As a developer or a tech lead, it's okay to start asking questions from your product team about terms, about things you don't understand. What is actually a credit swap? Can you walk me through this? Can you whiteboard what a derivative future is and help me understand this? And usually, most business stakeholders or product teams are happy to say, "Oh yeah, let me show you. This is okay, and the right time to start asking and learning about these things." You're in a meeting and somebody throws out a term, a zero swap rate, and you're like, "Can you explain what that means? I've never heard that term." Or you quietly write it down and you go Google it. Now, the reason I give this advice is because once you become a software architect, it's kind of expected you know the business. And as an architect, if you start saying, "Oh, can you explain this credit swap, or can you explain a zero coupon bond?" And all of a sudden, your product team and business stakeholders and analysts are going to look at you going, "And you're the one designing our systems." You start to lose credibility very, very quickly. So the right time to ask these questions and learn about the domain is when you're a developer, when you're a tech lead, before kind of jumping in. A junior architect, it's still okay. I would just watch what kind of questions, and I would probably do more Googling than I would asking. But yeah, this is something I learned as a lesson learned, one of my many, about having to understand the business domain to gain that credibility and be able to collaborate with business stakeholders. So yeah, it's critical.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. The first time I experienced this professionally, I was working with a team of senior talent, and it shocked me at how much business and related questions they ended up asking. And of course, I saw the output of that. I mean, it was amazing work. They'd end up finding patterns that were not directly addressable unless they understood the business, right?
Yeah, and to your point, Nathan, one of the things that I tend to evangelize now quite a bit is getting rid of the separation between development and product teams. These are typically two separate camps, and I have been in enough companies that actually have explicit rules that thou shalt not approach one of our users or business stakeholders or traders or any of these kind of people. You have to go through an analyst or you have to go through an architect. And to your point, Nathan, the more a team understands the business, the more that they can then collaborate with that business to talk about the trade-offs of a particular story or a particular feature or a particular requirement and say, well, that's going to be really difficult to implement. But understanding the business allows me to approach them and say, can we kind of have a quick meeting about requirement 23-2? Because I just want to show you the trade-offs. We can implement it, but I want to have you understand the trade-offs of this. And that's very difficult if I don't understand the business domain or the processing or what that whole requirement is all about. So it really helps form those engagement models between development teams and architects and the corresponding product teams. So
That's
yeah.
great. That's a good segue into section 3 of the book. Talks a
My
lot
favorite
about
section.
We really
and
enjoyed
it's
it
great.
too.
It's a nice lead up, and collaboration and negotiation, right, are two big themes there. I didn't think about how important the collaboration components were in the negotiation process, right? A lot of this is credibility building. It's making sure that you're justifying it through business cases. This reminds me, Alfred Adler actually is a psychologist who was around the same time as Freud, and he actually made the argument all problems are interpersonal problems, which is a very similar argument that's made in the book. I would love for you to elaborate on the sort of collaboration components that you've found important.
Oh, I would love to, because this is a topic that is my favorite topic, by the way, and I'll tell you the reasons why. Um, First of all, this particular topic was my personal lesson learned back when I first became a software architect, and I'm not very proud of the situation and myself, but it was a major transition in my entire career because I was I was a hotshot technologist. I mean, my first job as an architect, I'm like, well, it's about time because I know everything. And I was fairly egotistical at that time. And well, let's just put it this way. This was back in the mid 90s. Um, I was so harsh. I was so set in my ways that I basically, over time, alienated pretty much every single person on that project. And it was not one of my most proudest moments. And I had one particular friend who, well, magically stood beside me and really kind of helped me understand what I did. And focusing just on the technology, saying, well, you should know this, just leave me alone. Anyways, what I learned, and the project was a huge success. I mean, it came in under budget, under time, but several people actually left the company because of me. Most people left the project, and I pretty much alienated everybody. And it was my biggest, hands down, lesson learned out of 38 years of being in this industry. And that lesson learned was, wow, it really is about communication and collaboration and those people skills. And so that's kind of what cemented it for me. But coming back to the point and your question, because of that experience, I see a lot of companies, and I'm involved in a lot of companies that are building up an architecture practice. They are defining the various roles and levels of an architect, maybe a technical architect, a domain architect, enterprise architect, integration architect. And I help a lot with these kind of building up a practice. You know, we need to focus more on architecture. We don't have architects. We want architects. So fine. And I look at the spreadsheets. I look at the documents of the roles and responsibilities every single time, Nathan and Carter. Every time I see the one responsibility and the one hole missing, and that is, what is the collaboration model, both up and down? Well, what's the collaboration model between your architects and development teams? Who's leading them? Who's guiding them? What's your collaboration model between your architects and the various levels and your stakeholders and product teams? It's always missing. That's one of the pieces I usually am able to contribute to these defining these roles. But there's another aspect of this that I get really excited about that I'm glad you asked this question because I evangelize this too. So imagine you're a developer. You get a requirement. You see the story card and you're like, this is a rewrite of that whole section. I can't believe this came in. And so what do? Well, it's going to take a while. And you start ripping apart the system. You start re-architecting portions for this one feature. And it causes development teams to get really frustrated. It causes product teams to get really frustrated because why is this feature taking so long? Why is this costing so much? Well, because we had to redesign a lot of stuff. And it's like, blah, 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 blah. And you get this rift. that happens between these two camps? Well, this, in my experience and opinion, is one of the roles of an architect. Now, it doesn't have to be a title of an architect. It could be somebody on the development team who's taking on this role. My point is this: when we talk about collaborating with product teams, everybody tells you to collaborate. No one ever tells you how to collaborate. And here's a good example. So we get that requirement down, 23-2, and you look at it and go, this is going to derail this whole portion. This is going to impact our scalability. And it's also going to impact performance for this feature. Well, a lot of times the product team comes up with these requirements because they think it's a good idea and a need. But here's the key. Those product teams a lot of times don't know the trade-offs. They don't understand the implications of these kind of requirements. So it's a one-way communication, product team down to architect or development team. Well, what I say is understand the trade-offs, take that requirement, 23-2, and approach the product team and say, I'd like to talk to you about this because the trade-offs of doing this does require us to rewrite a portion of the system because it's not engineered that way, but also it's going to impact our overall scalability. By how much? Well, about 20%. Oh, let's talk about this. Is there a way we can change the requirement not to impact this? It's like, well, yeah, if we defer payment until after the update, we can keep that scalability up. Oh, okay, let's do that. And what I've just described is collaboration. Collaboration being working together to form a solution. And it doesn't always have to be technical. And so this is why that architect really needs some level of business expertise and the access to these kind of product teams. So I get very excited about these engagement models and the vehicles used and artifacts used to be able to do this kind of collaboration and really educating the product teams in terms of those trade-offs. So this is something that's currently very, very near and dear to my heart.
As we've been reading these books, it's a common theme we've seen across them, the benefits of playing nice with each other. We really enjoyed Martin Fowler's Refactoring and how he kind of reframed the process of refactoring as something that you don't need to take a huge chunk out of your day to do it, and then you're totally blocked off. You can just refactor as you go along, and you're making your code base cleaner and again just being a good team player. Let's say we flash back to the 90s. Mark Richards, who's in the middle of that project, and you're alienating people, and then someone gives you a copy from the future of Fundamentals of Software Architecture. You read part 3, you say, oh wow, this is a lot of good advice, I should be doing this, but you've already damaged some of those relationships. I think your book gives a lot of advice on here are some patterns you should have in general, but how would you go about if you want to make a change? You're listening to this podcast and thinking, oh, maybe I'm like Mark in the 90s. How would you go about changing? Not all of the 90s, I'm sure, in that one particular job.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The first part is actually that self-realization. And that was the thing that hit me so hard, was that self-reflection of just thinking back on the different situations and the way I interacted. And I said, wow, I was a real jerk. I'll use that word instead. And part of that is that internal self-reflection, because you can't really do much if you keep that same persona. So it's really that first piece of realization and changing your own attitude. Part of the repairing of those relationships, and I think I mentioned this in the book, is that technique about knowing when to fight and knowing when to let things go. And this is so simple, but so powerful because as the architect, well, you're making the choices. I mean, this is my architecture is what you typically say. Well, it's really not, but it's our architecture. I happen to be the one responsible for making most of the decisions in it. But the point being that letting things go and incorporating and involving people to the point of saying, that's let's go with rest between those two services. Sure, because when I look at it, my preference may be messaging, but if there's a strong preference for rest and it doesn't matter much, let it go. Let it go. It's not impacting anything in the architecture. It just happens not to be what I would choose. And by doing that, you start to be viewed a little more reasonable. That, okay, Mark didn't argue with me for once. This is interesting. And keeping that consistency of when you do say, no, here's why I don't want it that way. And justifying it really does help. But it's picking those battles is one great way of starting to repair some of those relationships. There's a lot of the core basic people skill pieces to start adopting. Saying hi once in a while, smiling, chatting a bit about something non-technical, just becoming a more approachable person. So ways you can actually change your own persona and get people to start actually wanting to work with you.
That's great. This also makes me think of Conway's Law is brought up several times in the book.
Whoops, hold on. Have to take a drink.
No worries.
Conway's Law is our current drinking game. Do you remember Bob Newhart back in the, I think it was in the 80s or 90s? It was a show called Bob Newhart. He was a psychologist. And anyways, all his friends would come in and it's like, hey, Bob, or hi, Bob. And it was a drinking game back in college.
Oh, was it?
This was in the 80s. And so anytime, you got together, it's like, okay, let's watch Bob Newhart. And everybody would have a shot. And every time it's like, hi, Bob, everybody would have to take a shot. Well, by the time the show ended, pretty much we were all blitzed. Well, Nathan, we started a drinking game in Berlin on 2019 called the Conway's Law. Now, this was at a conference, so we couldn't have alcohol. But every time somebody at some session at the conference said Conway's Law, everybody paused and took a drink. So anyways, I interrupted your question, but I just couldn't help it.
That's fantastic. Well, I'll make sure that all of our listeners are quite drunk by the end of this episode. So Conway's Law for the uninitiated is the link between communication structure and organization and how the organization builds systems. And in the architecture section, it's even pointed to that, this was a natural thing due to Conway's Law that, orchestration driven, service oriented architectures or these other pieces came out and it was solving this, enterprise problem by looking at the world through enterprise, colored lenses or whatever.
Yeah.
What I was curious about in our conversation here about changing our approach and doing these other things, have you seen successful changes in organization culture the reverse way? Meaning, could we change the way that we organize ourselves and communicate so that we can actually architect and build software in a better way?
Yes. As a matter of fact, there's a term for that. And it was originally coined the inverse Conway maneuver.
Oh.
Which basically completely turns that around and says, instead of saying, which is Conway's Law, the way we organize teams influences the way we develop software. Hence of why the n-tiered layered architecture is, for the past 60 years, still one of the most common and popular de facto. That's changing now that teams are becoming more agile or cross-functional. But the inverse Conway maneuver says, can the way we develop an architecture influence the communication structures of our company? And in fact, the answer is, in a lot of cases, yes, it has had quite a bit of success. This is actually one area that is lacking in the book, which we are going to fix that. But the influence of team topologies on architecture. There's a definite and definitive alignment between these. And Nathan, your example of Conway's Law is a perfect one of those. If the team topology, the way the team is organized and structured and the whole communication flows between that team, if that doesn't align with the particular architectural style you chose, quite quite frankly, it won't work. You will truly struggle because it is not a match. There's no isomorphism between those two. And this is something that we only really focused on what you just mentioned, Conway's law, and then in microservices, the inverse Conway maneuver. But what about event-driven architecture? What about space-based? What about the modular monolith? Does the team topology impact those? And the answer is yes. And we took that a little too lightly in the first edition of the book. Again, something we're gonna basically fix. So yes, we have found that over time, why isn't this working? And the architecture is sound. This is just, I mean, it scales, it's beautiful, but we can't get anything done. It turns out that, well, it's about the team size and team structure and the team organization. So yes, it turns out by realignment, things start happening. But to your point, though, a lot of companies can't achieve that organizational change. A lot of microservices efforts I've been involved in the past 13 years. Several of those, well, I won't say failed because we changed, but could not achieve their goals in microservices because it does require that organizational change, cross-functional teams with specialization, the introduction of testers, Q&A, release engineers, DBAs, all part of our virtual team. I mean, they're usually assigned to a domain as opposed to a small team, but they're sitting with us. They're understanding all the context. They're releasing our software. These are requirements for something as extreme as microservices, and some companies they can't achieve that. So we end up with stuff like service-based architecture, which is kind of a halfway point. Still an architectural style that's very, very useful. So yeah, there's a lot of influence back and forth between these two, and it's something we're beginning to realize. The fantastic book Team Topologies is one of those things I say is usually kind of a required read as an architect. Understanding that influence of the team structure and communication and how it impacts the way we develop software, the architecture itself, and some of the goals we're trying to achieve is just magical.
You keep hinting. You talk about, oh, we're going to fix that. We're going to fix this. It sounds like there might be more fundamentals of software architecture coming.
Indeed. At the time of this recording right here in June 2024, Neil and I are currently working on the second edition of the Fundamentals book. By the time we get this done, which will be beginning of next year in 2025, it will have been 5 years that book has been out, and it's still a kind of one of those quote bestsellers. We took a look at that. And I just mentioned one thing that we did see kind of lacking is this renewed understanding about how the team structure influences architecture. We didn't put a lot in there at all about AI and how generative AI can be used to influence or help us as software architects. We took cloud fairly lightly in this book, kind of focused on core architecture. Well, now many, if not most, infrastructures are now cloud deployed. And so we're adding those kind of elements to the book in terms of cloud considerations for all of the patterns and also the processes that we do. A couple of other major changes, we're adding some additional patterns that we kind of didn't have time for or space for. And really kind of cleaning up some of the text on some of the stuff we've learned over the past 5 years. By continually talking about this stuff and also experiencing it at client sites. So yeah, that second edition will have expanded to about 200 additional pages of additional stuff. So there's quite a bit we're adding in. We're talking about architectural alignment with not only team topologies, but with implementation, something we did not cover in the book. How architecture has to be aligned with the environment, with the infrastructure, with the company goals, all this alignment to actually make it work. We didn't talk a lot about isomorphism in this book, which we're also going to be adding. This concept of domain to architecture isomorphism. Something we realized after the book was released that needs to be in there. And what I mean by this, so you need a system that has to have the highest levels of performance and um, scalability and agility. And you say, you look at the star ratings, you do qualitative analysis and say, well, hands down, microservices is the only one that has 5 stars for all 3 of those things we need. So yes, it's microservices to the rescue. And we choose it based on that guidance. But what's the shape of our problem? We realize we have highly semantically coupled functionality. We've got a very large monolithic data that is full of semantic and implementation coupling that's going to be near impossible to break apart. We don't really have a problem where we have 100 different separate services or functions. It's all kind of doing one thing. And so the shape of that architecture doesn't match the shape of that problem. And even though we did all the due diligence on the star ratings, the shapes don't match. That's what isomorphism is all about. Do the shape of one thing match the shape of another? And this is really key to selecting the appropriate architecture. And so that's going to be another major addition to the book as well, influencing all of the patterns because each pattern has a specific shape. And there's domains that have shapes, and we're going to provide examples to all of those. So yeah, these are some of the things we're really enhancing to the book. So yeah, it'll be a lot bigger when it comes out.
We are excited for that. We are big book nerds here. I feel like I just found out like a new movie is releasing. We are we will add that to the backlog, and we will absolutely cover that in a future episode of the podcast.
Yeah, fantastic. Oh, that'd be fun because yeah, there's the nice thing is by choosing an architecture book, most of it remains pretty solid. Technology changes every year, and a book becomes obsolete after 2 years, and it takes 2 years literally to publish a book. And so by the time you publish it, all of a sudden it's like, well, there's a new language out that's better than this one. And all of a sudden it's like, yeah, not many people are going to buy this book. Yeah, no, that was old stuff. And it really gets frustrating. But Neil and I said, the only way we'll write a book together is if that book has at least a 5-year shelf life. And so far, our book is, like I said, still selling really well. And it will be 5 years in January. So yeah, it's
we had fun. We read Brian Kernighan and Rob Pike's The Practice of Programming, which is 25 years old. And it was like a blast from the past. And a lot of the advice still holds and is great. But there were some funny lines where it was like, a good CSV parser hasn't been invented yet, so we'll write one here. And I think there's about 1,000 CSV parsing libraries on NPM alone.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, but those are fun books to go back to and read. I've got Kernighan's book right there. It is.
There it is.
So yeah, so it's fun to go back and read some of those ones. Yes.
you could also see it was the scaffolding for the Go programming language because I mean you could see what was top of mind for Rob Pike, and he was just like, okay, if I could sit down with Ken Thompson and Robert Greismer, like we're gonna do this. And I mean, you could just every grievance he had in there, it was like perfectly addressed. I loved it.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated with this idea of writing with a co-author, and I would love to know, were there disagreements or differing opinions, and like how did you resolve and mitigate those types of things when you were working with Neil on this book?
Yeah,
because Nathan and I are at each other's throats like all the time over this podcast.
That's awesome. Yeah, well, it's interesting because with a lot of co-author experiences, you do have kind of disagreements and differences of opinion. It turns out we had very few disagreements. Most of those disagreements came about with a lot of the star ratings. Where my experience would say this should be 3 stars, and Neil's like, oh gosh, no, 2. It's got to be 2. We would take literally, guys, one characteristic of one architecture style. And we would spend weeks justifying and debating between 2 and 3 stars. I mean, that's why that took 7 years to create. And, but I loved those disagreements. I mean, we were regularly speaking at the No Fluff, Just Stuff conference that NFJS that exists here in the United States. And during its heyday, well, it was about every other weekend, close to 30 conferences a year on the weekends. And it was like a traveling roadshow. And that's where we vetted out a lot of our material. And so at the conferences, Neil and I would just, after we're done speaking, we'd just get together and we would just crank these things out, these kind of debates that we would have. But I loved them because both of us come to architecture with a different perspective. And the stars aligned because those two perspectives just melded together so incredibly well. But writing the books with Neil was a fantastic but sometimes frustrating experience because Neil is an excellent writer. And, well, let's just say I too many times start sentences of, there are 4 ways in which you can approach this problem. Boom, Neil's head would explode. Or use of passive voice. Yes.
We talked about passive voice on the podcast today.
Yeah. And as a matter of so Neil's a stickler for these. And so he would constantly be telling me, Mark, you're burying the chicken. You're burying the chicken. You're burying the chicken because of passive voice. The road was crossed by the chicken. And the problem with passive voice is too many times the subject is skipped. The road was crossed. That means you're burying the chicken because the subject is the chicken, not the road. And so it was a great learning experience writing with Neil, and it significantly improved my writing skills of that. As a matter of fact, Neil was very fond of writing a bunch of rake scripts to actually go through our book, which was written in ASCII doc, to find all these things. Any sentences said, there are, boom, error, nope. Can't commit. I was like, oh, come on. But yeah, we came together really well with the various topics that each of us knew and the experiences. So all 3 books that I wrote with Neil, that was the fundamentals, the software architecture, the hard parts, and the one we just released 2 months ago, the head first software architecture. Were just really enjoyable experiences. You know, we chat back and forth, we read each other's material, we complement each other as opposed to kind of butt heads. So yeah, it's a really wonderful experience.
It's nice having a buddy that's a big part of the reason Nathan and I did this podcast together is we had been wanting to read these books for a while, but we needed an accountability partner. And it's one thing to read the book. It's another thing to meet up and discuss and bounce those ideas. I love what you said about the passive voice. We, Tanya Riley in the Staff Engineer's Path also. Yeah, that's a great book. And she says, instead of burying the chicken, she says, by zombies. If you can end a sentence with by zombies, then you're using passive voice.
I love it. That's great. Oh, I'm going to have to remember that one. That's good.
Well, thank her for it. That's a fantastic book. It's another one in our backlog. You talk about presenting, which I think is something that engineers struggle with, right? A lot of engineers maybe aren't the best public speakers. And you talk about, you have a lot of great advice in the book about becoming familiar with the tools. I loved the whole section on PowerPoint. I think this would really speak to a lot of engineers because there's not really any platitudes in that section. It's a lot like, I was surprised that it was like, you might want to consider this transition when you want to make this point. And so I think that can help build confidence. Do you have any other piece of advice for engineers who might struggle with public speaking and presenting and how they can build confidence in selling their technical vision?
Yeah, it's as a matter of fact, you are correct, Carter. It is such an important skill of an architect. Part of it is I call it the 4 C's of architecture, which I introduced in the book, communication and collaboration, which we've already talked about. But the 2 that are germane now are being clear and being concise. So part of it is just starting to practice how to be concise. we have some complicated stuff we have to describe. We have complicated solutions. I need to explain this to you. And boy, nothing's worse than somebody that backs you into a corner and starts going on about, well, we're making a restful call. You know about REST, right? It's representational state transfer. It was a dissertation by Fielding, which wasn't really meant to. And all of a sudden, it's like, I don't have all day. I literally have 10 minutes to listen to. And so, avoiding tangents. One technique I use, which I gained during the pandemic, was I started to do a lot more online training. And as a result of that virtual training, my classes would fill up with people all over the world. And I realized, boy, I talk fairly quickly. And so one of the things I had to practice, and now I've got almost too close to perfection, is effectively speaking. In other words, slowing down your speech a little bit, because there's people who are bilingual who are having to do that translation engine in their head. The other technique that I can give advice to is effective pauses. We call it in the book the brain breaks. And that is making a point or doing a particularly difficult piece and then just pausing for a little bit and then moving on. It helps slow down your speech. It helps avoid those what we call hang words, the oh, because if you pause, it's okay to have dead air because I'm taking in something you're describing to me, and it could be fairly complex. As I'm listening to you, I'm also trying to comprehend what you're talking about. I'm also visually I'm looking up at my whiteboard here. I'm looking at your architecture diagram too. There's a lot of inputs coming in. And an effective pause really, really helps to make things a little more concise, a little more engaging. The other tip that I would give people is this. Everyone loves a story. You know, you're kind of bored, you're at a party, and somebody goes, oh, speaking of Jamaica, let me tell you about what happened the last time we were there with the shark. And I'm like, oh, I'm all ears. And suddenly you're no longer bored at this party. You're like, tell me more. I mean, people love stories. And so a lot of times, kind of take your architecture, what you're trying to describe, and form it into storytelling. Make a narrative, a beginning, a middle, a resolution. This also helps to engage people in what you're talking about, make them listen. And that sometimes is difficult to try to create a story out of the communication patterns I'm trying to describe here in this architecture. But I could start that story talking about what some of the options are and what my journey was through those and what I discovered and what I came up with. These are kind of some of the techniques to help prepare people for those times when we do have to present to a stakeholder who are very busy and largely don't care what we have to say a lot of times. So we make it interesting. The other tip is make it personal. A lot of times we tend to bring a lot of people into an office or a room and say, okay, I'm going to describe my architecture. People like, this isn't even my domain. I don't know why I'm here. And whether it's verbal or physical in person or written, targeting that specific audience really does help build up your confidence because people are listening because this is germane to my domain. This is impacting me. And so the more you can get somebody to pay attention and listen to you, the more confidence you'll start to build up. And so those are a host of various tips for just kind of practicing and getting better at that speaking part to a stakeholder, to a development team, to another architect even.
Have you ever read Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath?
No, I have not.
It's a great book, and the kind of theory behind it is that all effective communication, sticky ideas that you remember, follow a similar pattern. And they kind of, I believe they're Harvard professors, and they illustrate with an exercise at the beginning of their class where they have students present doing this. And what's cool with these kind of patterns that you can follow is they're totally divorced from charisma, from eloquence, from nationality, even fluency in English. And so I just, as we've been talking about it, I check it out if I were you, and listeners, I think we'll probably read it one day. But I think it's great for software engineers because I think some of us think like, oh, but I don't look like a movie star. I don't speak like the president, right? So yeah, that's a great one to check out for anyone interested.
Yeah, I've got it. I just wrote it down, so I will check
Right.
it out. Yeah.
Well, cool.
But building that confidence to speak also requires kind of a conviction or a confidence in your solution, something you're passionate about. If I'm excited about this solution, I want to tell people it's a lot easier to get less nervous and build up that excitement. But the cautionary tale, still practicing being concise. We tend as technologists to start going down that rabbit hole of getting caught in the weeds of technology. And not everybody needs those details. I may think they're critical, but Carter, if I'm explaining a solution to you, you don't need that many details. And so filtering that and practicing that filtering does help in effective communications, especially with stakeholders who don't need all these minute level of details. Developers might, but not stakeholders.
This is amazing. We've really enjoyed this conversation today. Before we go, there's one question that we want to ask. Our podcast is called Book Overflow. And so it's really important for us to understand what are some of your favorite software engineering books, either on engineering in general or architecture. And then also that you can also extend that to business books or non-technical books as well.
Yeah. So on my website, first of all, I'll start backwards and then move forward. On my website, developer2architect.com, and that's a TO, so it's developer transitioning to architect. If you go to the About Me page, scroll down about halfway, you'll see books I read. And so every year I maintain a reading list of these are non-technical books that I love reading. And I give a little review and I do a star rating, 1 to 5 stars. And it's just something I encourage my friends to do, because I'll finish a book and I'm like, oh, that was such a great book. I wonder what Neil's reading. I wonder what Nate's reading. I wonder what Raju's reading. And so I'm encouraging all my friends to have these reading lists, because these are friends I really respect and we have similar tastes. And I may see a book and it's like, ooh, that looks really good. And now I've got more books to read. So I do have that, of which you'll see the genre is literally all over the place. My favorite genre is science fiction fantasy, which I just get absorbed in. But if you scan through the list, you'll see there's a lot of books. It's like, I can't believe Mark would read that. But people would give me these books or say, oh, you got to read this. I'm like, okay, I'll give it a try. Two of my 2 books, technical wise, that I really am enjoying and have enjoyed. The first is most recent, Jackie Reed, who wrote Communication Patterns. This is communication patterns for architects and developers. And these are sets of patterns that are blocked off in terms of visual, written, all sorts of communication modes, but various ways of being able to increase and improve both your written and verbal communications, presentation skills. And it's a fantastic book. And so that's one that is on my favorite list. And the other I really enjoyed, Gregor Hope's book, The Architect's Elevator. And that was a great book. Again, it's about those communication, soft skill pieces of being an architect, which, again, I find is half of being a software architect. So that's another one that's kind of at the top of my list from a technical standpoint. Really enjoyed Ian Gorton's book about building scalable systems. Fantastic insights into scalability. And something I actually learned. I love when I can learn something from a technical book, because you think it's like, oh, I know all this stuff. And it's like, oh, I did not know this. and he talks about a different realm of scalability from a cost perspective, the
Hmm.
economics of scalability. And it's like, this is fascinating stuff. I mean, he hit it spot on. So that's another book on my top of my list. So yeah, these are some that I love, have loved reading, and I continue to refer back to. So those are a collection of a lot of them.
Well, thank you so much for the recommendations. I think we've written them down and are going to add them to our backlog. Um, well, thank you so much for joining us today, Mark. We really appreciate you taking the time. We loved the book, Fundamentals of Software Architecture. If you don't remember, um, yeah. Any closing thoughts for our listeners?
No, and first of all, just enjoy the book, and that look forward to the second edition coming up at the beginning of
Absolutely.
2025. And just fantastic questions, Carter and Nathan. I loved these questions. I come into these podcasts not knowing what to expect, and I actually really like that because I don't like prepared questions. I like just chats like this, and it makes a great podcast. But your questions were fantastic, hit all the areas I'm really passionate about. So
Well,
very much appreciate those.
thank you. We always like to say about the podcast, it is a book club masquerading as a podcast, not a book
There you
report
go.
masquerading as a podcast. We feel that
There
way
you
when
go.
we talk to the authors, that we don't want to be a Q&A. We want it to be, an authentic conversation. So we really
Exactly.
appreciate the answers. It's so great having spent the past couple weeks with you via print to spend an hour or so with you, virtually in person. It really is a
You
treat.
bet. Well, I very much appreciate you having my book in your book club. So that was fantastic. Thank